What is an NPC? You probably already know the answer, but guess what? You're wrong. Or maybe you're not. Let's find out. Non-player character, 2 words and a living prefix defined simply as a character in a role-playing or video game that is not controlled by a player of the game. Well, we still don't have a great definition because this definition is very, very broad. And it includes an expectation that maybe isn't there so much in a video game. That expectation being the inclusion of a DM, a dungeon master, someone who is controlling the NPC and using them to drive the player forward in the story. Perhaps immediately you think of Dungeons and Dragons simply because I said DM, and that's the correct connotation here. I'm glad you made it. The reason I bring up D&D is because non-player character is a D&D term. The first definition comes from the player's handbook. The game persona of each participant is called the player character, in order to differentiate it from personas created by the referee, called non-player characters. And that's it. That's the sum total of explanation behind NPC from D&D. Eventually, the handbook goes into some basic suggestions for how to build an NPC, but it never defines the term any further. This mistake would be fixed in later versions of D&D, and the 5th edition handbook describes NPCs as patrons, allies, enemies, hirelings, or just background extras in an adventure. Often, one of the NPCs is a villain whose agenda drives much of an adventure's action. So, what is an NPC? Is one of the vending machines in Borderlands an NPC? It speaks when you interact with it. Or is that just a prop? And if that's a prop, then are the vendors in World of Warcraft with no dialogue lines also just props? What about enemies? Are they NPCs? They move and attack and maybe have some lines of dialogue, and they are certainly controlled by a DM in some ways, as long as we expand DM to also include the designers of the video game. If they exist only to be immediately killed, perhaps respawned ad infinitum, are they too just props? For the oldest gamers, you might be tempted to simply differentiate enemies as mobs or mobile objects. This term was coined by Richard Bartle, who co-created the first MUD or multi-user dungeon called MUD 1. From MUD 1, mobile objects. I called them that because creatures moving in a controlled but unpredictable way are kind of like the mobiles that hang from ceilings. Well, I was in kind of a hurry. So, what is an NPC? I think the key part here that we tend to forget is character. It's a non-player character, and that character is important. Certainly, we as gamers tend to ascribe some level of NPC-ness to something with a face, but I don't think the vendors with no dialogue are automatically more of a character because they have a face than the vending machines in Borderlands. I don't think an automatically aggressive, infinitely respawning enemy that charges without care for its own safety is a character either. As with so much that I talk about, it's about the nuance. Focusing on that need for character, NPCs' impact on games correlates first and foremost to their impact on believability and immersion, namely how these constructs impact the narrative of the game. In fact, going back to MUDs, when Bartle created the mobs term, it was because he felt NPCs were entities that look like the player and would think they were the same if given the AI. The whole reason for separating out mobs from NPCs was to show that NPCs have character, that they could think they were players, that they could pass some sort of emotional Turing test. Now, personally, this hard-coded division between NPC and mob eventually becomes harder to maintain as games become more advanced and more specifically as the types of game genres expand. It's hard to say that a pink space troll is a mob and not an NPC simply because it doesn't look like a player, given that with an AI, it could still pass for a player. So while mobs was a term originally created specifically to split off monsters from characters, I think this is still a bad definition, but it does point in the correct direction. What is a person? Personhood is a moral concept in epistemological philosophy that originated to help philosophers like Descartes, Locke, Hume define consciousness. And it's been expanded and discussed by, well, just about everyone, considering even here on this YouTube channel on this day, we're talking about it right now. It's a pervasive issue, to the point that it shows up in court cases on a pretty regular basis. For example, is a corporation a person? Is a monkey that takes a photograph sentient and self-conscious enough to own the rights to that photograph? Are aliens people? Is artificial intelligence intelligent enough to be considered people? If you were to replace one organ on the same human every year, how long until they are no longer considered to be human? If no cell in your body is older than 15 years old, then are you a new person on your 16th birthday? It's a deep concept. NPCs aren't people, of course, at least not yet, but we can attribute many of the same sort of thoughts to their categorization. This is called characterhood. Notice the parallels with personhood. Characterhood is helpfully defined as the state of being a character, so that's the end of that. To do a bit more work, though, we could use some of the more widely accepted definitions of personhood to determine what characterhood could be better defined as. It's a good thing all philosophers agree universally on these things. The two most defining features of personhood are a continuous consciousness over time and the ability to act rationally based on interpretation of that continuity. Basically, to be defined as a person, you must be able to string your consciousness from moment to moment and use the information you attain to make decisions that make some rational sense. Beyond the fact that this is remarkably open-ended, we can take this concept and define characterhood as being within its bounds. That is, a character must have intentional memory and be seen to be acting rationally. I say intentional memory, not just memory. It must perform actions with a sense of rational intent. This seems pretty easy now, actually. Is a monster an NPC? If it charges you once you walk into its circle and has no further defining features beyond raw aggression, then no, it's not an NPC. I think this definition doesn't really surprise anyone who has studied writing or theater, because narrative character has been well understood, at least on an instinctual level. Even if you've never read a single thesis, even if the words mentor, foil, secondary, and tertiary protagonist means nothing to you, you can watch a show or read a book and know when a character has no character, when a character is flat or acts inconsistently. This is when people will say things like, this character is well written, or this character is a Mary Sue. And it's why you as a player don't need to read a bunch of ethnographic fieldwork to determine that having characters with believable in-game schedules helps improve immersion. With games, it's slightly different because we interact with these characters in ways that may seem to be more fluid and natural than reading them off of a page. And in this, I think a big part of the elevation of NPC from anything to character revolves around our emotional attachment to that character. It's well documented that interpersonal attraction is based on three things: how physically attractive someone is, how socially attractive someone is, and their task attractiveness. We like people who look good, are friendly, and are useful. With a character in a game, these two are relevant. Not only are we expecting them to maintain a sense of memory and work rationally within their own intent, but we judge them based on our physical attraction to them, our social attraction to them, and how useful or how much of a hindrance they are to us. We judge them by how we feel about them. And this is perhaps why so many people have such strong feelings about companions in games like Dragon Age or Mass Effect. Games that focus on providing materially different companions that click into our personalities in different ways, and then expand on those characters to provide real emotional attachment. There is no doubt that you can feel strong feelings of affection and attraction towards fictional characters, that we can begin to identify these characters as friends, and that these emotions add enjoyment to the game. There's a really interesting anecdote from Mass Effect about players who tinted their armor to match Garrus, and other players who only wore enclosed helmets in order to experience a sense of fellowship with Tali. There's not a huge amount of research in this field, but we don't really need it to know that these things exist. Games make us cry, they entangle us emotionally, and this is expressed in no better way than when we change our own behaviors to attempt to identify closer with a character. And this is a significant step towards defining an NPC in a meaningful way. They're not just mobs, and they're not props. You might want to compare them to actors, but unlike in a movie, when the camera stops rolling, there is no more character. They exist only with us and through us. And this, well, that's a tough kind of ephemeral existence to affect us so strongly and yet have so little permanence outside of that effect. What NPC affected you the most? Do you remember a story or a moment with a character? Tell me down below in the comments. I'd love to know about it. Thank you so much for sharing this video. Every one of you who does is a real hero that's fighting the good fight against the evil algorithm. And as always, I'll see you on the next one.